Good afternoon, good evening. For most of us, there are people joining us both from the East Coast Mountain Time and West Coast Time, and then there are those joining us from around the world. I want to welcome all of you to the North America Think Tank Summit. This morning, we had a summit with close to 800 people, global summit. With representatives from around the world. We have been conducting these summits in virtually every region of the world. And to date, we have had a Latin America summit, a Asia summit, a European summit, a Central and Eastern European summit, a global summit, and we will have a MENA and Africa Summit in December, and an all-China Think Tank Innovation Summit on November 23rd, the evening of the 23rd and 24th in Beijing. So spanning two major time zones. I want to thank all of the participants, which are have registered our 240 from all three countries and from countries around the globe. The vast majority, logically, are from Mexico, Canada, and the United States. First, I'd like to thank my research interns, whose shoulders I stand on, and I always neglect to recognize them, and I want to recognize their contribution to helping make each and every one of these summits a success. I would also like to thank the planning committee that has helped both mobilize participants for the summit and have suggested speakers, and also in terms of the content of the program, help shape it as we move forward. The suggestion from the International Planning Committee was to have an opening session be the same at all of the summits, and that opening session focuses on a regional assessment, country by country, of the impact, both in the short term and the long term, of COVID-19. That involves the economic, political, social, and public health challenges posed by COVID-19. The effort really, and I want to underscore this, those who have come to these sessions from the very inception have come looking to commiserate with their colleagues, to have a sense of a community of what now is a well-established global community of think tanks, but most of all, to learn from the leading think tanks, to hear their ideas, and most importantly, to provide suggestions for how we are going to deal with COVID-19. I asked all of you, we are just coming off a highly contested election here in the United States, and I would strongly encourage you to do two things. One, focus on the issues, focus on the recommendations, and leave, if possible, the commentary on the elections on the side. People are here to hear about your ideas and take on the COVID crisis and the direction it might take. They're also looking to see how they might survive as an institution, and more importantly, how they can serve their countries and citizens where they operate. Every summit focuses on two areas, which is reflected here. One is on the policy challenges, and specifically that is today is being shaped by COVID-19. However, many of the issues that we have discussed in previous summits have been accelerated. And this morning I had organized a session the COVID-19 impact, the great accelerator, transformer, and terminator, meaning that it has accelerated a number of trends, it has transformed a number of institutions, and may well be a terminator, meaning that many of the institutions we know may not be able to weather this storm. The winds are strong, and the challenges are intense. And the hope is that what you will share today will help those institutions that have not, in advance of this crisis, strengthen their institution in terms of planning, in terms of a digital platform, and have become what I urge and have urged at past summits is to become faster, better, smarter, more digital or more tech savvy and more agile. Only those institutions that have taken those steps in advance will weather this storm. And I'm seeing in terms of the data that we collect, 2 or 3 major trends which I'll reveal. One is that there is significant churning at the top. So both presidents, vice presidents, directors of communication are departing. 2 major institutions that are well-heeled, meaning that they have a good structure, a good financial base, are taking and making drastic changes and cuts in their operation. Thirdly, we have seen in terms of the data that we've collected over the last 5 months, we've been collecting data from think tanks around the world. And the figures from April and May, when we started to collect till now, have been revised downward by institutions in a very significant way. All of these, and then I call, as you know, and write to think tanks all the time. You may think incessantly, but what happens is that the bounce backs from institutions, I see how many of their staff have left. And so the numbers in all of those areas are growing. These are troubling signs. And it is precisely why we have the session we have today. One, to provide concrete solutions that think tanks are no longer ivory towers, are no longer and simply institutions that produce research and ideas, that they have to also provide action and transform ideas into action, and to demonstrate continually why think tanks matter, especially in a crisis. So without further ado, I'll transfer the chairmanship here to Brian Finley, who is the president of the Stimson Center, to chair the first session. Brian?
Thanks so much, Jim. It's I think I speak for everyone on this at this meeting, Jim, to express how grateful we all are to you for your good efforts in bringing us together like this on a regular basis. And congratulations as well on a global summit just this morning. Sometimes I think of you as a one-man band, Jim. You've got the keys box under your arm and the harmonica, and you're strumming a guitar as you're walking along the sidewalk. It's really remarkable how while you've got a great team of interns, you really have very little support to pull these off, and it's really remarkable. And again, I think we're all grateful to you. I think obviously coming together, as you mentioned, Jim, is now more important than ever, given the unprecedented strain that the sector really is under. And obviously, COVID has fundamentally changed virtually every facet of how we live our lives and every facet really of our business as well. And as Jim noted, I think the impact upon the sector has been and really will continue to be staggering for the foreseeable future. But we on this first panel are really in an enviable position of merely having to admire the problem and leave the unenviable task of identifying solutions to the subsequent two sessions. So over the course of the next couple of minutes, we're going to hear from colleagues, as Jim mentioned, from Canada, from Mexico, as well as the United States, really measuring and gauging the impact of COVID on their respective countries. given, of course, that these three individuals that you are about to hear from are remarkably talented and problem solvers at heart, I suspect that they will veer away from just describing the problem and maybe help begin to point us to some of the lessons learned and prospective pathways ahead as well. So I thought we would just get right to it, if I may, and turn to Jason Clements first, whom we all know, of course, as the Executive Vice President of the Fraser Institute in Canada. And Jason, I wonder if I can ask you to give us really kind of an overview of some of the maybe nearer term impacts that COVID has had, not just on health and health systems in Canada, but also the more immediate economic impacts that you're seeing across the Canadian economy.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you, Brian. So first, in terms of healthcare, basically the COVID pandemic, at least in Canada, has really brought to the forefront longstanding problems in our rather unique universal system. So we constantly compare ourselves to other universal healthcare countries that are high income, and consistently what you see for Canada is that we're a high spender with modest to poor results when it comes to access to resources, technology, quality of care, and wait times. And so those pre-existing problems to COVID have really now come to the fore for many Canadians. So for example, of the 10 countries covered by the Commonwealth Fund, we rank last in wait times. Of the 28 countries covered by the IMF on access to doctors adjusted for population, we rank 26th out of 28. That frankly just didn't set us up well to deal with the pandemic. Now, the second problem, which is clearly playing out, is we, as of May, have canceled somewhere around 300 to 400,000 surgeries that were non-COVID related. The government of British Columbia estimates it's going to be 18 months just to get back to a break-even point as of May. That doesn't include all the cancellations from now until November. So we have both a problem dealing with COVID itself, but also non-COVID health issues, which again, those are pre-existing problems to the system. Now, the one bright spot is there seems to be increasing interest in fixing the Canadian system and learning lessons from other universal healthcare countries like Germany, Switzerland, Australia, who both on the spending side and more importantly, really on the outcome side, do better than Canada. Now, on the economic side, unfortunately, we do not fare well. I think actually you'd be hard-pressed to look at the 35 industrialized countries covered by the IMF to see a country that's doing as poorly as us. So in terms of the latest data from the IMF, Canada is expected to have the 11th worst recession in 2020, the fourth highest level of unemployment. At the same time, we have the highest level of government borrowing. In 2020, the expectation is we're going to borrow almost 20% of GDP. That's largely the federal government, but also our subnational provinces, the equivalent of states. Government spending has increased substantially. It will reach almost 60% of GDP this year. There's only 5 countries that will have, industrialized countries, there's only 5 countries that will have a higher level of spending as a share of the economy. And so we have a bookend problem where we have incredible amounts of spending, but we're not seeing a more resilient economy relative to the other 34 industrialized countries. In addition, almost all of the provincial and federal borrowing in 2020 is financed by the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada has indicated it is going to start to step back on emergency measures. So there is an open question about what the interest rate structure in Canada will look like, both for the private market, but also in the immediate issue of the cost of government borrowing. And part of the issue right now, at least in our analysis on government spending, is that the federal government in particular has focused on expediency rather than effectiveness and targeting. So we looked at $82 billion in income stabilization programs. Up to 25% of that was either poorly targeted or outright wasteful. In addition, we did some other examination of income stabilization programs. We found that almost 1/5 of those programs actually increased the recipient's monthly income, in some cases by up to 300%. And so The problem here of focusing on expediency means that there's a lot of people who are getting assistance who don't need it or don't need it to the extent they're getting it. While at the same time, which is much more worrying, we have a number of different types of households, particularly single parents, who are not getting the assistance they need. So I would certainly, from the lesson of Canada, one of the things is that expediency, while helpful, shouldn't trump effectiveness or the targeting of assistance. And that's certainly why we see the spending levels and borrowing that are worrying us right now in not particularly 2020, but certainly on a go-forward basis. So hopefully that provides a bit of an overview on our economic and health challenges in Canada.
No, that's really, I'm so grateful, Jason. That's an excellent and rather sobering analysis, and I wish we had time to kind of delve into that more deeply. But let's continue to kind of work our way south here and maybe turn, Stephanie, to you. Stephanie Aronson, of course, serves as the VP and Director of Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution here in Washington. And so, Stephanie, I'm going to try something with you a little different. I'm going to try to ask you 3 questions in rapid succession here, if I can, just to challenge our acuity. First, I wonder if you could just give us a quick kind of macro level assessment of how the pandemic has progressed in the U.S. and where do things stand right now?
Stephanie, you're muted. You need to unmute your mic. There we go.
Start by saying how much I appreciate being included in this really important event. So the U.S. is in the midst of a 3rd wave of the pandemic. I mean, our cases are rising rapidly. We had close to 150,000 new cases yesterday, and we're now averaging about 1,000 deaths per day. And hospitalizations are up, and in many cases, hospitalizations are running out of space, and we're seeing the same inability to handle sort of non-COVID health problems that were mentioned before. I think another thing that's interesting is that the epidemic has really shifted now more to the Midwest and the Mountain West of the country, and it's hitting rural communities that were previously isolated during the earlier waves. And so I think that is sort of changing attitudes and understanding about the pandemic. At the same time, cases are also rising again in the East Coast and the South, which were hit earlier. And I think overall, it's not being dramatic to say that we're really facing a crisis right now.
So in light of that, then, Stephanie, can you, I wonder if you could paint a little picture for us in terms of kind of the implications of that on the U.S. economy and how policy has either stepped up or failed to step up in response.
Yep. So I think the U.S., did go into a deep recession in the spring. GDP declined at about 31% at an annual rate in the 2nd quarter as families self-quarantined and many non-essential businesses closed. However, we actually have seen substantial improvement in the economy since May. And actually, looking at that same IMF data, the U.S. has about the 3rd best performance economically out of sort of advanced economies. The unemployment rate, which had shot up to 15% in April, has now fallen back to about 7%. And although that's still over 4 percentage points higher than prior to the pandemic, it's obviously a significant improvement. Now, I would say to a large extent, the improvement is due to the reopening of the economy that we've seen in the States. But at the same time, the U.S. actually also did have a fairly strong policy response. Now, I don't want to say that the response was perfect. We're getting evidence now that some of the money intended for, say, small businesses went to larger businesses that maybe had less need. So I think there's definitely was room for improvement, but overall, I will say that we got aid to households, to the unemployed, and to businesses relatively rapidly. And at the same time, the Federal Reserve stepped in to ensure market functioning and support lending, not only to money markets as they typically do, but also unusually to states and municipalities and to corporate bond markets. And that's something they hadn't done before. And I think overall, this did contribute to the substantial improvement that we've seen in the economy. But I do worry looking ahead that prospects are less good. So first of all, combating the 3rd wave of the pandemic is likely to necessitate more quarantining and business closures, and that's going to be a drag on economic activity. And at the same time, the fiscal relief is running out. Many of the programs have expired or they'll expire in December. The funds that were sent to households are being used up. So looking ahead, I expect job growth to slow and perhaps for the unemployment rate to even rise again. And one other thing I want to just point out about what's happened in the US is that the suffering caused by the pandemic and the recession has really been unequally distributed. Although, in many cases, elderly and those with pre-existing conditions have higher mortality rates. In the US, it's also been the case that African Americans and Hispanic communities have suffered much higher mortality rates. And the recession has also hit those communities much harder, in part due to the sort of industries and occupations that those workers are in. And so what we've seen, for instance, is that while the unemployment rate for college-educated workers has almost returned to pre-recession levels, it's still much higher for workers with a high school degree or less. And, given the burden of both the pandemic and the recession on these communities, I think it isn't surprising that the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor by police this summer prompted a huge social justice movement, and any policy response we have going forward is going to have to take into account this reality.
So, Stephanie, just in 30 seconds, Stephanie, can you give us tick through the top two kind of policy reforms that the incoming administration really needs to focus on?
So I think that there are two things I want to point out. One is that clearly our health system and our public health system was just not up to the challenge. And more generally, our infrastructure for administering policy, for instance, getting money out to households and to businesses, is completely outdated. And I also want to point to the macroeconomic environment in which, we're operating now. Like in Canada, the debt to GDP ratio in the US has shot up. Our deficit is high. This is not only due to the, pandemic spending, but also due to structural problems we have with our budget. But at the same time, interest rates are very low. And that might suggest we have more fiscal space for handling some of these problems going forward than you would otherwise expect. And I think that's something that policymakers are going to need to think about as they're trying to figure out how to move forward.
Right. Thanks so much, Stephanie. That was enlightening. And last but not least, Ernesto, welcome. Ernesto Veloso, of course, serves as the president of the board at Fundar in Mexico. So, Ernesto, let me turn to you. So even prior to the crisis, obviously, Mexico has had particular challenges related to economic growth, economic inequality, poverty. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the crisis and these factors have played out in regard to obviously the impact of COVID in Mexico, and then turn a little bit to talk about how the government has either effectively or inadequately responded to the crisis.
Thank you very much to everyone, and I'd like to join in commending Jim McCann for bringing us together and organizing this event. Thank you, Brian, for leading this panel. Thank you to the organization team for all their support, and I am pleased to talk about the implications of the COVID pandemic in Mexico. And yes, the issues of economic growth, poverty, and inequality play a huge role in the impact, in the short-term and long-term impacts of the pandemic in Mexico and the alternatives that public action has in face of this health crisis. Just for example, with swaths of workforce making a living in the informal sector and a weak and untrustworthy institutional framework, all this makes making or deciding to impose mandatory lockdowns a very difficult policy. So what we are seeing is trying to deal with voluntary close downs with some enforcements and trying to reach an equilibrium that is difficult and may hinder the effectiveness in the health front of those policies. Just in terms of the short-term health impacts of the pandemic in Mexico, we are nearing the million case. In the following weeks, we will reach that benchmark. We are near to reaching 100,000 deaths officially resulting from coronavirus. And in the last 14 days, we have been seeing increase of 10 and 14% in those indicators. However, we have to look at these figures with a bit of a pinch of salt, because Mexico has one of the lowest testing rates in the world, and particularly in Latin America and in North America. We have just an average of 14.5 per 1,000 people, compared with Chile, that has 196 per 100 people, or the United States, that has almost 400 people per 1,000. So we have a problem with the numbers. Another indicator that could be more reliable is the excess deaths. And the Mexican government has said that we have registered 59 more excess deaths than expected after the pandemic struck in March. Not all these deaths could be caused by coronavirus, but they are mostly a result of the health crisis in the country. Many will be allocated to the coronavirus, but also we have to take into account that 1.5 million people is, we have calculated, an important think tank in Mexico has calculated that we're not able to attend hospitals or emergency rooms with other ailments such as cancer, diabetes, and hypertension because of the pandemic crisis. It is important also to point out that Mexico has a very high rate of deaths among health workers. We have 1,700, more than 1,700 public workers in the health sector that have died from this, and 127,000 have contracted the disease. So we have a huge problem in terms of institutional capacity, equipment, medicines, etc., in the public health sector. This is a combination of very, very diverse health systems, and of course the most vulnerable populations are more affected by death rates and of cases per 1,000 people. For example, indigenous communities have almost no information available for them to take action against the pandemic. Many of them doesn't have a medical service, a permanent available medical service. So we still have a long way to go in terms of creating the basic infrastructure and the basic requirements to deal with a pandemic in a context of acute inequality and a very severe economic downturn that we haven't witnessed since 1922. Well, that's the situation in Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you so much again for that sober assessment, Stephanie. Thanks to you and Jason as well. And Jim, we'll go back to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Excellent overview from the three countries. We now turn to the hard work, as Brian has indicated, of looking at how we deal with this crisis. And Fernanda Diaz-Torres, who is the International Relations Director for the Center for the Study of Espinosa Iglesias. I'm sure I murdered that, but. Fernanda? Yes.
Here, you hear me already?
Yes, right. You are ready.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. It says Central Estudios Espinosa Iglesias, so it's okay, don't worry about it. Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to the third session and second panel where we'll discuss from ideas to actions. As a global society, we are facing many challenges, as a matter of fact. The pandemic we face this year is and will have tremendous impacts in all aspects of our lives. The nicest forecasts foresee that the world economy will recover until 2022, but for some countries, as mine, Mexico, it will be until 2024. which programs, policies, and recommendations should be taken into action to help all the citizens cope with this and everlasting changes is the core aspect of what our experts will say right now. Undoubtedly, the answers are complex and they'll need to analyze the changes in a depth meaning, but also having a lot of flexibility and most to know the ways and means of bringing all these ideas into actions. How will these ideas be taken into action? How will these be brought to life? Certainly, the new era that we are living forecasts a different agenda towards health, economy, environment, education, and all the other aspects that you want to see. And all of them will be interconnected in the lasting need, especially now, to diminish the inequality that we're living in the world. This new era needs agile and concrete recommendations made by policymakers, journalists, and of course, think tank scholars. So here are some questions that should be taken into consideration that I'll ask our participants. Are think tanks or your think tank bringing their ideas and research into action? Do you have or are you looking for partners, either other think tanks, government or academic, to bring them into action? And how do you see the role of your thinking after the changes done by the pandemic? So let me remind our speakers that each one of them have only 5 minutes to address these remarks. Therefore, let me introduce you to Edward Greenspan, President and CEO of Public Policy Forum from Canada. Edward, you may start. Thank you. Edward?
You're muted. You're muted. Edward, you're muted. Your mic is muted. Yeah, there you go.
I am good, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Ed Greenspan. I'm just going to take 30 seconds or so to tell you about the Public Policy Forum since I'm new to you guys. Founded in the 1980s for a place where cross-sectoral policy conversations could occur. We're member-based, about 220 members, federal government departments and agencies, all the provinces and territories in Canada, private sector corporations, labor unions, universities, colleges, NGOs, Indigenous groups, etc. Non-partisan, non-ideological. And we are just wrapping up the first phase of a project that we began at the beginning of May called Rebuild Canada, in which we've done about 20 papers and helped stimulate a debate about what's going to come out of this in the medium term. We felt governments and other decision makers needed to prepare themselves to address policy weaknesses that would be exposed by the crisis. Some of these would be new issues that hadn't been on the agenda before, like supply chain sovereignty issues, and some of them would just be changed trajectories of existing issues. Governments would be having to deal with changed public expectations, which has happened in the context, as you heard a little bit from Jason, in the context of a different fiscal environment, greater public debt. Now, having said that, Canada has had 285,000 cases of COVID and 11,000 deaths. Canada is a pretty easy rule of thumb to compare to the United States because we're about 10% of the size. So if you multiplied that by 10, we'd have, if we're the United States, we'd have 110,000 deaths so far. As well, just to put the fiscal piece in context, you know, Canada, because of a great fiscal reckoning in the early 1990s, got its fiscal house in order and came into this crisis at the federal government level with a debt to GDP ratio of about 32%. Our subnational units have greater capacity to borrow than they do in the United States, but still a very relatively low debt to GDP level, which after this year should be about 70% probably federal and provincial together. The federal government will be under 50%. And people have mentioned low interest rates. You know, the fact in Canada is that borrowing costs, the cost of servicing borrowing, will be next year lower than it was last year because of the low interest rates. So this has enabled the government, which is a government that is not averse to spending in the first place, to, as Jason has said, outspend everybody else in the G20 in per capita terms on relief programs. but doing so without still leaving us in a much better fiscal shape than anybody else in the G7 for sure. I want to just touch on two issues if I can, Jim, that are sort of perhaps uniquely Canadian and more long-term issues. The first would be the Canada-U.S. relationship, and I think it's important to remember that about a third of Canadian GDP comes from exports. That's nearly about 3 times the rate of the U.S. and about even 1.5 times the rate of China. And 75% of our exports go to the single market in the United States. So even before COVID, Canadians have been concerned, riled, I'd say, by the aggressive demands to renegotiate NAFTA and rather specious national security measures against our steel and aluminum exports. But this isn't all of... I'm sorry?
2 minutes remaining.
Yeah. As well, this began long before because of the first rejection of the Keystone Pipeline project by the Obama administration was a shock to, I think, a number of Canadians, particularly in Western Canada, and being totally outside the spirit of the 1989 Free Trade Agreement. So today we have a crisis of confidence, I think, in the U.S. border and in the U.S. measures. Early in the crisis, 3M was shipping 3 million N95 masks to Canada, and the Trump administration blocked the movement of those masks. That dented confidence in cross-border supply chains. And now there are concerns as well around vaccine nationalism because Canada doesn't have much manufacturing capacity. It has probably the lowest manufacturing capacity in the G7 for that. So Canadians, as I think everybody would know, are wannabe Democrats, and polls here show they would have voted 80% for Joe Biden, and that's a phenomenon that occurs election after election. So still there's a fundamental wariness, I think, of the United States and a fundamental wariness of our dependence on the United States. We're probably the 4th most concentrated market country in the world in terms of our dependence on a single market, and we don't have the outlet that we thought we might have in China because of a crisis point there. So there'll be a lot of attention to that over the next couple of years. And the second issue,
we have time. We've run out of time.
My 5 minutes are up?
Yes.
Okay.
So I mean, if you quickly summarize, and because you're taking it from other people, so if you can do it quickly, please.
I'll just say the other major crisis that we have to look at is the oil industry and what we're going to do as a country that is believes in the Paris Agreement and has signed on to the Paris Agreement, but has a very important oil sector and one that contributes a lot, our biggest export, and keeps us from falling into, we're already have had 11 consecutive years of current accounts deficits in Canada. Without the oil industry, those would be very deep deficits, and this impinges on our ability to keep interest rates low. So somehow or another, we are having to reconcile quickly having the oil sands, the ugly blot on Canada's reputation, it seems, but nonetheless a huge returner to the economy with our need to decarbonize them. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much for your remarks, Edward. It's a shame that we don't have more time, but anyway. Now let me introduce you to all of you, Dr. Rebecca Shirasi, Vice President and Managing Director of Ideas Lab Center for Strategic and International Studies, ICES, of the United States. Rebecca, you may start, please.
Thank you. And thank you for having me, and thank you to Jim and everyone involved. I echo my colleagues and congratulations. So I think for CSIS, a lot of the key things that have been important issues over the past few years remain critical. This new global situation only makes them more urgent. Issues like healthcare and global health security, trade, China and what's next there, alliances, the new security environment that always is evolving, and climate change, to name a few. And, as we look post-election and as we look at this pandemic climate, to the chair's question of how do you bring ideas to action, and looking at partners and considering the role of think tanks post-pandemic. I think as ever, we are more important than ever before. Our ability to look ahead will continue to be critical, especially at a time when so much of the government and so much of just the immediate needs are just conquering every dollar and every piece of attention. So I think in terms of our role in bringing ideas into action, it remains critical that we are able to look at the immediate and advise on the immediate with practical solutions that engage not just our policymakers, but also the policy influencing environment and the public, while also continuing to look ahead at the future and the many global challenges to come. We've done some great work at CSIS with our Health Security Commission and our Trade Commission in particular, both of which were bipartisan commissions looking at these threats and issues. Our Health Security Commission came out with a great list of recommendations. This was just before the pandemic fully hit. We were shockingly accurate in our concerns and predictions. And there's a lot of really great practical steps there that came from very deep conversations and bipartisan efforts. Similarly with our Trade Commission, I think this is a time, even more so than ever before, to be entrepreneurial, to be innovation driven, to think of new ideas. We are in the business of ideas, obviously, all of us in the think tank world, but this is the time more than ever to continue to lead on not just new ideas, but new solutions. This world is different than it was 6 months ago, but that will always be true. We will continue to evolve. And there are definitely solutions to even these problems, as massive as they may seem. I think, to the question of partnerships, I think this is going to be very important for countries overall. These are not issues that are siloed in one area or another. These are global issues, and how one country deals with them very much affects others. And I think this pandemic has proven that again and again. And so I think as we, as think tanks, look at these issues and think of solutions, it's important that we not only come up with practical solutions in our local environment, but that we can look beyond that and build on that with the various alliances and partnerships. I think that includes relationships with other think tanks, with the corporate industry, with the corporate partners and industry, with governments. It's about helping the United States, I think, build back alliances that have faltered during the past 4 years. And it's about considering the new issues that are of even greater importance to our younger generation than they have been to our more seasoned generation. That includes climate change. I think, there are issues that the world are putting front and center, and, we're going to have to talk about them. I am mindful of time, so I will just say as a final note, on the CSIS end, I think what we have done very successfully over the past few years, and we continue to invest in, is engaging our audiences, whether they are our immediate core audiences of where we're trying to influence, or the audiences that we need to bring with us in order to make the changes that we need happen. Engaging them through dynamic products is key, right? This is a world that is now even more so than ever virtual and digital. We have to be able to operate well in that environment. There's a lot of noise. We have to be able to cut through that noise, and we have to be able to do that through data-driven, expertise-driven, understandable, engaging work. We're competing in a different environment. The issues are far too big. And if we can't connect and if we can't present effectively great policy solutions that are practically attainable, then we are going to be in even worse states than we are now. And I believe that we will continue to do well. We will continue to make great progress, but that's going to require some new approaches and adaptation. Thank you.
Rebecca, thank you very much. It is quite important what you just said and shared with all of us. And I would say it's very important that we should not forget that we're in the business of ideas, and we need to take them, go further every day a little more. Thank you very much. So now Brigitte Wagner, Vice President for Policy Promotion of the Heritage Foundation of the United States, will give us her remarks.
Thank you, Jim. Again, for my second time today. In the pandemic, Heritage launched a major initiative, the National Coronavirus Recovery Commission, made up of former legislators, business leaders, and members of the nonprofit and faith communities. Through a series of meetings, listening sessions, online submissions, and staff work that developed nearly 300 specific recommendations for federal, state, and local governments, business, churches, charities, and community organizations, we help them to navigate prudently towards recovery. And on June 15th, the Commission released its final report. The Commission made more than 40,000 contacts with policymakers across the United States, and 35 U.S. states adopted the Commission's top recommendations. Many of the recommendations are still valid today, and we continue to write on these and update our trackers, databases, and advise legislators. And you can follow our ongoing work at heritage.org/coronavirus. We know that in our large and very diverse country, state and local officials play an important role in monitoring and protecting vulnerable populations and opening economies or restricting movement. And to help in that effort, we've called on the federal government to make our data more widely available. The pandemic has revealed what we think, frankly, is disastrous public health consequences of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's failure to follow multiple congressional mandates to modernize its data infrastructure. Current reporting methods are burdensome to frontline medical workers and restrict only they result only in fragmented data that's not available in real time and usable across systems. So we've called on the Congress to require HHS to prioritize the electronic collection and dissemination of robust, privacy-protected data that will better leverage existing systems while reducing burdens on clinicians. We've also called on HHS to quickly enter into a public-private partnership with a data management expert to develop these systems. We've also called for better guidance on testing. In the months since the pandemic first hit, we built an enormous testing infrastructure in this country that can run over 1 million tests per day, and we now have rapid screening tests available. We have called on the federal government to empower greater access to this testing to slow the spread. Americans in long-term care or nursing homes must get regular and frequent tests, but also ordinary citizens can perform rapid screening tests before a high contact situation like flying on an airplane, for example. This could help increase safety and reduce fear. We should empower patients to be able to conduct these tests. On the economic front, we believe that any assistance provided by Congress should be targeted and temporary, and we're working with our allies in the state think tanks all across the country to call on federal lawmakers to be cautious in flooding state budgets and rewarding overspenders. This money coming from the federal government often results in state and local tax increases, and bailing out the states only postpones the day of reckoning. Some states have further requested waivers from the federal government to reduce certain federal obligations, and we've shared these requests with other states. The business community and those organizations representing small business have called for legislative and regulatory changes to access capital for small business. And this morning we heard a call for infrastructure investments to expand access to broadband. Free market organizations have asked that we incentivize the private sector, research and development and infrastructure investments with permanent full expensing. And in the area of education, this is my last area, we've seen a failure on the part of many public schools to reopen or even provide a consistent level of education for our K-12 students. Many private and parochial schools have successfully opened for in-person instruction, and parents have taken on responsibility for homeschooling or forming microschools. We've seen very little in the way of sharing best practices between schools that are reopening successfully and those that haven't, and we're seeing a rise in efforts to regulate some of the most innovative efforts to provide children with the education they need during this difficult time. Frankly, innovation should be encouraged when so much is at stake in our children's education. We believe that innovation rather than regulation should be the order of the day in this crisis. Thank you.
Brigitte, thank you very much. You are right. Indeed, there are a lot of disastrous effects of this pandemic, and we need people like you and your think tank that shed light what should be done about it. Now,
Vivian, you may want to jump in here. We've lost her.
I'll go ahead. Thank you, Jim.
The show must go on.
I'm talking to you today from Texas, and our population in Texas is half of the population of Italy, yet we are tied now with Italy in terms of our cumulative number of COVID cases. As of yesterday, it's about 1,060,000 in both of these areas. That being said, it's a great place to test a vaccine. So at the Baker Institute, we are a university-based think tank. So we have the advantage of having a good deal of analytic expertise being on a university campus, but we can pivot more quickly relative to some of our colleagues on campus who have other long-term projects that they're committed to. So what we did this summer is, with the help of Baker Botts, a local law firm, we had their support to submit an expedited Freedom of Information Act request to the CDC to ask for all of their case report forms for COVID. And we did that, and we received the uniform case reports between May 5th and July 16th for the entire country. And so what surprised us was that there was so much missing data in this case report form. It is an incredibly detailed report form. If you just Google it, you'll find it would be incredibly rich if it was actually complete. So just to sort of build on top of what Bridget said, we have resources that could tell us a lot. We just can't make use of them. We did find a handful of states where we could analyze some data, and the data is consistent with what you're finding from other sources, that the disease spread was much more overburdened on the Hispanic population than the white population, and also that that COVID tended to spread a little bit slower. So whites were sort of affected later than the Hispanic population. The data also confirmed that the workplace and the home were very strong sources of transmission. And so in terms of why the data was incomplete, we then searched around, and it turns out that reporting of COVID to the CDC is voluntary. And not only that, there is no standardization of these case report forms, which is why some are being filled out on paper and fax. So what Bridget is saying about electronic standardized information is absolutely critical. It's just shocking that there are counties that they have their own case report form and sending them across by fax machines. So what we would like to see is, we hope the next administration sends a strike team to just a handful of U.S. cities to really get complete full case report forms. And this is why the information that you can get from those case report forms will tell you statistically how safe or dangerous it is to fly. It could tell you which workplaces are the most likely places where COVID spreads. So for example, there are places that are shutting down small retail shops right now, and it's not clear to me that those places are safe. You could leave them open and allow their economic activity to continue. The best epidemiological data, the studies on safety, are still from only South Korea and China. They've ran out of cases, so they can't report on this. We don't have really good data from the US, and so this is where we need to move. If you think about it, if you get exposed to COVID now, you kind of sort of know that you should get a test within 5 days, but we need to get the distribution by day in terms of when people actually test positive. You could do that if we had complete case report forms. We don't need them for the entire country. We just need complete data for a small number of areas. And I'll stop there.
Fernanda, yeah.
Did you hear me?
No, your mic was off.
Well, just
now
to say,
Vivian,
thank you very much for all your information. It's quite shocking what you just told us. And Jim, thank you very much, and all of you for letting us be with this virtual North American Think Tank Summit. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Fernanda. It was an excellent panel with a lot of provocative and challenging information that we need to act on. I now turn to the final panel, the call to action, and Laura Lucas Magnuson, who is the Vice President for Communications and Strategy at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I turn it over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Jim. Echo everyone's appreciation for the opportunity to be here and the important discussion that we're having. The great pleasure of opening this last panel today, where we are looking at how we address the challenges that have been laid out. And I'm delighted to introduce each of our speakers and ask them how we can move forward collectively. We have with us today Graham Fox, President and CEO of the Institute for Research on Public Policy, Daniel Rothschild, Executive Director of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, Veronica Ortiz, Executive Director of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, and Duncan Wood, Vice President of New Initiatives at the Wilson Center. First, I will turn to Graham. Graham, you're an expert on government reform, democratic renewal, and citizen engagement. And given the stresses of COVID-19 that we've been discussing, and also thinking about the polarized moment in which we live, how has your thinking on policy challenges ahead changed? And in light of that, what would be your specific call to action today as we digest these conversations?
Thanks very much, Laura, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone can see me. I cannot see myself on the screen, so I'm just going to launch into it and hope for the best. Let me begin by thanking Jim McGann and his crew for ensuring that we have yet again this year the opportunity to get together, and just delighted to play a small role in this afternoon's program with the very difficult task of trying to bring together this rich discussion. Let me start with obviously the Canadian perspective on this, and being someone who's particularly interested in the processes of public policy and governance. My first observation is that the pandemic really has highlighted some strains in Canada's federal arrangements. Many people on this call will know Canada is arguably among the most decentralized federations, with our subnational units playing a meaningful role in economic development, playing a dominant role in healthcare, and playing an almost exclusive role in education, specifically K-12 education. And so a pan-Canadian response to this pandemic required meaningful federal, provincial, territorial collaboration. A lot of Canadians, and particularly political observers, were surprised at the level of collaboration in the early stages of our response. Where we seem to have set aside our national pastime of having government leaders argue with each other and really aligned our strategies. But my own observation is shutting down required discipline, required courage, but didn't require creativity. So it was not so much a surprise to me to have intense collaboration and close collaboration during that period. And it's only now in the second wave that we're really seeing the strains and the fault lines reopen because of the tensions between a desire to reopen the economy as much as the cases will allow, but also fighting the public health imperatives. And so that balance really has kind of begun again, those intergovernmental tensions. And I think looking to the future, what it really says to me is, we have to set aside what has always been our approach to reforming Canadian federalism, and it may be the case in the United States and Mexico, to really see our two tiers of government as being airtight compartments. And to have this urge to say, let's disentangle what the subnational level does versus the national government's role, and let's try and keep them separate. And what we've lived in the last 6 months really shows me that we have to move beyond this notion of disentanglement and go towards managing interdependence. These issues are too complex to be able to have separate to-do lists. And the Canadian federal system has to mature to be able to accommodate that. And we're just not there yet. My second comment really has to do with being careful about not giving COVID too much agency. The pandemic has created a lot of meaningful policy problems. It has highlighted some other existing problems, and in fact, it has cast aside some problems that were meaningful before that we're not talking about anymore. And I think in designing our policy response, we have to be very careful about understanding what box we're dealing with. And in the Canadian context, long-term care and employment and income support are two great examples of systems whose woeful inadequacies were highlighted by the pandemic, but that were not created by it. And so as we design our policy response, we have to remember that Canada needed to deal with employment insurance long before COVID cases started creeping up. We needed to deal with long-term care, which has been a horror show in Canada and is responsible for a disproportionate number of deaths in the last 6 months for decades. Successive governments of all political stripes have been ignoring it. And we have to be careful about making sure that the policy response recognizes the true cause of some of the things that we're trying to fix. The third thing I want to say, and it echoes a comment that Vivian made about data, and I'm going to sound like my high school math teacher here, but to say it's time for governments to show their work. It was appropriate and probably understandable early on that governments kind of dispensed with telling us exactly where the uncertainties were, what the modeling might show, and just try to get us to stay home, wear a mask, and limit our contacts. But we're certainly seeing from a citizen engagement and a citizen commitment point of view that our subnational governments that are more forthcoming with information about how they think this will develop tend to be the ones that also enjoy more popular support for some of the restrictive measures that citizens still have to carry on if we are to bring the pandemic under control. And so show your work, governments, and I think think tanks can help them do that, in part by encouraging them to do it directly, but also by being out there a little bit ahead and saying things that perhaps our government partners can't say themselves. And as a last point, call to action, and again, echoing something Rebecca said during the previous panel, and it's specifically about us as a think tank community. There is no question that many of us will be facing important economic challenges or financial challenges in the months and years ahead, and we can't be flippant about that. But I, for one, have rarely seen governments more open to input from outside organizations because they genuinely do not know how to deal with so many aspects of this. And so let us seize the moment. And to echo something that I've heard Jim say time and time again, let us demonstrate the value of think tanks in the constellation of policy actors. And this is probably an occasion like none other, certainly unlike any I have had as CEO in my time. And so I think if we seize that moment, not only can we improve public policy, but we can improve the standing of the think tank community in public discourse. So Laura, thank you for that time, and look forward to the presentations from Daniel and Veronica.
That was great. And I'm also reminded that when you show your work, you get partial credit. So point well taken. So moving from governments to markets, Daniel, I was hoping that you could comment on sort of market-based solutions that you study at the Mercatus Center. Do you see there being untapped opportunities to apply an economics and market mindset to the challenges we've been talking about today?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and Jim, thanks for having us today. So I want to begin by kind of outlining what I think are three stylized facts that somewhat limit some of our opportunities going forward on COVID, but I think that they are, in fact, facts, and we have to take them as constraints in the way that we approach this. The first is that to a large degree, policy debates right now are defined around negation. They're about what people are against, what groups, not what they're for. And I think that this is true across the political spectrum and across different geographies. Second, we're just seeing a decline in reason as the mode of discourse. And of course, this is the world that think tanks inhabit. We rely on reason, we rely on facts and data and argumentation and logic, and this has just given way in far too many cases to emotional appeals. And third, what Yuval Levin identifies as outsiderism, this pervasive belief that people who institutions, both in government but also in media, the arts, and beyond, that they are in fact outsiders that have no real control, no real agency over the institutions which they control. So all three of these really do create some challenges for us going forward, but I think some opportunities as well. The first, because political parties and actors have in so many cases given up on developing positive agendas, This is a fantastic opportunity for us. I think that market liberal think tanks, for instance, can really step in and develop a positive agenda around innovation and economic dynamism that neither party in the United States and very few parties in Europe are actually interested in developing. And COVID has provided us a good, we've seen over the last few months, dynamism in the scientific and medical communities, among entrepreneurs, both in small businesses and large businesses. So how do we develop an innovation and dynamism agenda that takes the best of what we've seen over the last 8 or 9 months and really builds on that going forward? And you look at some of the most sclerotic areas of the economy today: infrastructure, healthcare, K-12 education, higher ed, fintech, housing. There are opportunities across the board to develop this innovation and dynamism agenda. The second opportunity I see, and it's really it goes to the question of how we instantiate some of this. Vivian and Bridget touched on last panel. We've got to begin serious consideration about how we restructure the regulatory state. We've seen over the last few months that it is just far too conservative, innovation averse. We've allowed the precautionary principle to in by osmosis to a lot of regulatory decision making. And it's just in many ways not fit for purpose for the kind of innovative, dynamic economy that I think that market liberals should really be pushing for and talking about. And then third, and this may seem like a weird thing for think tankers to talk about, but to some degree, I think we've seen politics become too central in our daily lives. We've seen politics as something that is not just a means of collective decision making that's governed by democratic norms and institutions, but something that has become incredibly tribal in a lot of ways. And to a large degree, I think that this isn't necessarily a policy issue, although questions around strengthening civil society, the intermediating institutions that give people a sense of meaning, that give people a sense of status, the ability to work together on a voluntary basis outside of political means, I think that we've got to see a revitalization of these. Something that Bridget was pointing to earlier, a lot of the best things that we've seen over the last few months have been things that have come out of civil society, voluntary institutions. Anything that we can do to develop an agenda, not just for policy, but a moral agenda for our communities and for our society to rebuild these institutions, I think is so much the better in the United States and across North America.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I thought that was really, I like the energy in that and the sort of thinking of what we can do versus what we can't do. And Veronica, I was hoping to build on that in my question for you, because one of the challenges that's come up against the backdrop of coronavirus is just the overall policy environment that is under strain. And how has your organization addressed this, given the breadth of your work and your membership?
Thank you, Laura. And let me start by just congratulating Jim on the incredible work done this year and the sense of community you have built. I'll just start by giving like a broad overview of how the Mexico has been affected by the COVID, and last one we met in April, we had a different scenario and what we're looking at now. So early this year, the COVID-19 hit Mexico, a country structurally weakened and already unprepared to face the pandemic, at least on 3 fronts, and I'll be very quick on this. On the public health system, on the economic side, and on the security side, which is very important for Mexico. So on the public health system, we were in the middle of dismantling a public health program that was also always perfectible, but a very successful Seguro Popular, popular insurance, meaning health insurance, that was meant to provide health access and treatment and medicines for people that were not covered by social insurance. So at the end of 2018, more than 60 million people were covered by the Seguro Popular. The new government vowed to pretty much repeal and replace that system, but they just got to the repeal phase, not to the replace. So it was defunded completely, the Seguro Popular, and they just changed the name. So the 60 million people were left basically unattended for, and that's when COVID hit Mexico. On the economic side, Mexico had GDP growth, very mediocre, 2% average for the past 10, even more years. But 2019, at the end of 2019, that mediocre figure, I mean, looked optimistic. We fell to minus 0.1 GDP growth. So that's when, again, COVID struck. On the security level, despite the change of the policy toward criminal organization, criminal gangs, organized crime, and the creation of the National Guard, 2019 was the deadliest year in record for the past 20 years. So we had more than 34,000 deaths and still accounting for, a very, very somber scenario. 8 months later, where are we? As Ernesto Velasco from Fundar previously said, we are reaching 1 million cases of COVID and almost 100,000 deaths in the next few days. But you have to account that we are under-reporting cases and deaths. And the specialists say that we had to multiply that figure for at least 2.5 times. So we'd be surpassing even the United States if we account for those deaths that are not being accounted for. So it is a very somber situation in Mexico. And as he said, we do have that shameful first place in the deaths of health personnel and the medical professionals. So it is, as I say, a very grim scenario. On the economic side, Mexico will fall, Mexico's economy and GDP will fall this year at around minus 9.5 to minus 10%, and will not start recovering until next year, bit by bit, and maybe until 2024 will reach the economic 2% mediocre growth that I just mentioned. This would have cost 12 million jobs because there were no fiscal resources allocated to saving businesses and employers. And this will also add, in the pandemic this year, this will also add more than 11 million people, or push more than 11 million people to extreme poverty. So that's the situation economically. We'll start recovering. Okay, thank you. We'll start recovering. But even with the USMCA entering into effect this July, the recovery will be very slow for Mexico in the next coming years. And on the security side, we are facing as a deadlier year as last year, despite the confinement. So things have not worked on that issue. What are the challenges we're facing as think tanks? And in Mexico, not only think tanks, but civil society is facing a hostile environment politically. Every day from the presidential office, civil society and the think tanks are being disqualified, and they're being very, very aggressively attacked, increasingly scrutinizing and fiscally harassing donors and funders. So that has provoked also a very restrained budget that we have to deal with. What do I see going ahead? Of course, this has also given us the opportunity to bring together, because unity will be our strength domestically and abroad, because we need at this time to make civil society and think tanks in Mexico be heard beyond our borders. So going digital as we are now has given us the opportunity to reach far more audiences. So I think we have to do that, and we have to bridge the gap with society. This morning, Bill Burns talked about the 71 million people that voted for Donald Trump, and that would mean something. Well, here in Mexico, we have to also take into account the 60% or more popularity rate of still having the President López Obrador. So these people we need to listen to them, not to preach to them, but listen more and bridge that gap between, as I said, to build a social support. More than ever, I think expert analysis, fact and evidence-based policy matter. As Ivan Ellis from the CSIS said in a report, we, Mexico, are the neighbor more at risk in the region of North America. So that's why civil society and the job of think tanks matter the most, as Jim McGahn says. That's why think tanks matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. And, you talked about the grim picture, but also the opportunities for us to work together. And I want to pick up on that theme as we turn to Duncan. From your vantage, looking at U.S.-Mexico ties, do you see greater opportunities for collaboration on the challenges that we talked about today? And what are two ideas we should walk away with?
Thank you, Laura. And let me just pick up directly from something that Veronica just said. I think now more than ever, it's vital for think tanks to reach out to their colleagues in other countries that are under stress. I spend most of my time thinking and working on Mexico. And I've been told so many times that the things that we can say in Washington about Mexico, think tanks in Mexico cannot say themselves because they'll get into a great deal of trouble. And yes, we get heat from the embassy, we get heat from the Mexican government itself, but they can't touch us. And that's a fundamentally important thing. So I think that all of us who are in that privileged position of either being in the United States or Canada, we look southwards to Mexico and we see think tanks who are doing good, impartial, nonpartisan analysis, but are getting heat for it from the government. We need to think about the ways in which we can help them. But let me directly answer your question. I'd like to divide it up into two parts, Laura. The first one is on sort of the basic question of communication and collaboration. Everybody who's on this call has discovered that during the think tank, yes, we've been able to communicate, collaborate with organizations in other countries and other parts of the world to a hitherto unknown degree. And that's because of the Zoom boom. And that's really something that has helped us along. But it's also exposed for us, I think, the very real need to improve our internal communication and collaboration procedures. Because now that we're not all going to the office, we don't bump into each other in the line to get a coffee. We don't bump into each other as we're hanging out having our lunch. And those informal conversations all of a sudden disappeared. And finding mechanisms that we can create to overcome that, whether it is, as we do at the Wilson Center, the program directors get together on a Friday afternoon for our water cooler conversation, where we talk about whatever it is we want to do. So we try to have as organic a conversation as possible. That's very, very important. It matters to me in my new position because I'm in charge of nominally new initiatives, but what that really means is actually helping all of our programs to collaborate more closely on predominantly four spotlight issues to do with great power conflict, the great digital game, the rule of law, and the Arctic. And I think we've had significant success because we've had to think about this. Before we just took it for granted that we would bump into our colleagues and we could have this conversation. Now we actually have to make the extra effort, and that's really been good for us, I would say. So both internally and externally, we've had this. And let me just talk about one example of the collaboration, the successful collaboration that we've had both internally and externally. Is a project on 5G in North America, part of a broader project on a North American tech trust, where we worked between four programs within the Wilson Center, and then we worked with partners at CG up in Canada and with the Tec de Monterrey in Mexico. And that has been a fabulous collaboration. It really shows what's possible. A negative side, I would say, though, of the Zoom boom is that what we've discovered, and I think all of us have seen this, is that today anybody and their grandmother is now capable of putting together a Zoom conference. What used to be the domain of think tanks where we were kind of the experts and we could convene, now anybody does it. It's extraordinary. Every day you see how many events there are out there, and they can get pretty good guests to come onto their programs. So where does that leave us? Well, I think that we have to go back to something that Rebecca said earlier on, which is that we're supposed to cut through the noise, and there's a lot of noise out there right now. She also said that talked about the importance of being data-driven. I would like to stress the impartiality, the nonpartisan approach. Working with technical experts, that's something which, again, is possible now in a way which was much more difficult before we started working virtually. And I think that we need to be the best. I mean, that's really it. Competition is good. Competition is good for think tanks. When we look out there and we see the programs that some unknown organizations are putting together, wow, that actually looks quite good. That should drive us on to do even better. And I think we need to get back to the real job of think tanks, which is not just to host conversations. That's a very nice thing that we do, to convene. It's actually to get some real research done. It's to talk with real experts, to get real data out there. And honestly, it's this year has really made me rethink what it is that we do as think tanks. And that is incredibly healthy. And that, I think, is probably the most important thing that we can carry forward.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Jim.
Okay, thank you. Laura, what a rich set of suggestions from your group and the other panelists. I just want to, in closing, thank all of the panelists for all three sessions, just extraordinary, representing once again the value of coming together. I consciously when I first thought about having a summit, clearly, given the numbers, the inclination would be, well, don't worry about the Canadians or the Mexicans, just have a U.S. summit. And I felt that really did not make a lot of sense, and that redrawing the geographic lines and underscoring, which I think is the central part of these meetings, the fact that we need to work together, that it's in more and more increasingly in our interest, that our fates are tied, whether it's on any range of issues, and that the proximity and the economic value and benefits of working together far outweigh the costs, and that it's the more we can do that in terms of our countries and institutions will be to all of our advantage. Just a few cross-cutting themes. Winnie Satchelberg this morning at the Global Summit mentioned, which I think is an important dimension given the polarization and the populism, which a colleague in Spain at the European Summit said populism is dead and has been killed by COVID. I think that is, I didn't challenge him when he said that, but I think it's dead wrong. I think that this morning Winnie said we need to essentially develop programs not only for urban areas, but for rural areas. And in terms of our programs, I mentioned after 2016 that we needed to get outside the Beltway. It was clearly an issue that came into focus then. The reality is very little happened. And the fact that we have 71 million people who voted for Trump, that the country is divided, that the crisis in terms of COVID is hitting that area of the country, means that if we don't respond to those in the urban areas and in the rural areas, if we, as Veronica said, we need to start listening, not only meeting with people, but listening and doing something about it. And as Duncan said, think about innovative ways to reach groups. The other point that I would make in every crisis, and Winston Churchill said, don't let a good crisis go to waste, which is in terms of the themes throughout, in terms of innovation and transforming our institutions is key. But the reality is that in every crisis, whether it is domestic or international, the empirical evidence in terms of the establishment of think tanks, there's a surge. I am uncertain as to whether there will be a surge, even though there is, as every one of you have mentioned, a very great need to challenge conventional wisdom. And that there are many institutions that will be weakened, 25 to 30% in the US and elsewhere, and I'm already seeing it, will go out of that have closed their doors or reduced their operation, which I see on a regular basis, may not return. And clearly there are signs in that I see on a regular basis. The numbers will be greater in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Central and Eastern Europe. And so we need to be aware of that, because problems in one segment of the think tank ecology, both nationally and globally, affect all of us and affect our work and effectiveness. It's odd to me. I mean, I know that CSIS and others, in terms of Fraser, have a health policy area. I think a challenge for all of us is that health policy think tanks, which are in great number, both global and domestic, don't come to any of the summits, have not been engaged in any of these conversations. And I just ask, why aren't they? Why don't they see the meetings with their fellow think tanks as something of value that they should engage in? The other part that has been dominant is reliable information. And it's not just simply truth decay or speaking truth to power. We really need to speak truth to ourselves if we are to be effective. And, you know, as Duncan and Daniel have said, there's a number of things that we can do. And the reality is that policymakers really are not, and have not been for some time, the sole audience for our work. That the public and these, you know, NGOs, et cetera, are groups that we really need to listen to, engage, and partner with. So those are just a few closing comments. This, as all of the discussions, have been both rich and informative, but the most important thing is that you're here, that we are together, that there is a network of institutions in North America, and together, one, we need to continue to make the case why think tanks matter, especially in a crisis, and also help those institutions that are struggling. And all of us need to essentially have the goal of being better, smarter, faster, more tech savvy, and most of all, in this environment and going forward, much more agile. Thank you all. Cutting into dinner and to happy hour. So I will end quickly now and thank all of you and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.